Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we sift through the sources, extract the vital insights, and equip you to be the most informed person in the room, or at least the most thoughtfully prepared one.
And today we are tackling something truly fundamental.
Absolutely. We're doing a deep dive into the fascinating history of how humanity learned to calculate uncertainty. And, the huge paradox we're facing is this. Despite mastering the math, we are still failing spectacularly to manage the risks that really matter.
It's a disconnect that defines our era, really.
Imagine a courtroom in 1842 filled with the heavy silence of a life or death decision. The case is U.S. v. Holmes. A lifeboat, leaking and overcrowded in the freezing Atlantic, forced a crew to make a choice no human should ever have to make.
An impossible choice. Who stays and who is thrown into the sea to save the rest?
You might expect the judge to grapple with ethics, survival instinct, or, maritime law, but instead Judge Henry Baldwin argued something that sounds entirely alien to our modern ears.
It really does.
He claimed the victim should have been chosen by a lottery, not because a random draw is fair, but because a lottery was an appeal to God.
An appeal to God. Not just a fair mechanism, but a direct line to the divine.
Exactly. In his eyes, the luck of the draw wasn't luck at all. It was a way to let the Creator physically step in and pick who lived. It's a chilling thought, but it points to a massive hidden gap in human history.
A huge gap. We've been measuring stars and building complex geometries for thousands of years, yet this science of uncertainty is a relative newcomer.
Why is it that the geniuses of ancient Greece or Mesopotamia, who mastered the laws of the physical world, never once codified the laws of a dice roll?
It seems like such an obvious thing to us now.
For 5 millennia, we possessed the tools. We even had the astragalus, those irregular animal heel bones used in games since the pharaohs. But we were blind to probability because we were blinded by purpose.
Purpose. That's the key word. Everything had a reason.
To the ancient mind, there was no such thing as a random event. Every toss of a bone, every flip of a coin wasn't a statistical data point. It was a private, sealed letter delivered directly from the gods.
So to try and calculate the odds.
It would have been seen as an act of heresy, an attempt to predict the unpredictable will of a divine being. We didn't just need better math to understand the world. We had to despiritualize the universe and accept the terrifying idea that sometimes when the dice fall, nobody is watching.
That courtroom scene is the perfect setup. It shows just how deep that fatalistic mindset was, even in the 1840s. So our mission today is really to trace this monumental conceptual shift.
Right? From divine decree to predictable patterns.
And we want to examine what that transformation allowed us to build. We'll see how it was central to the rise of modern state capacity, enabling things like insurance and data-driven governance.
Then we pivot.
And we analyze why, despite all this math, modern organizations, military, financial, you name it, still fall prey to these ancient human biases when they're faced with a surprise.
The blind spots.
The blind spots. And finally, we get to the great irony of our time. How today's systemic global risks, climate, cyber, instability, are challenging the very foundations of the mathematical solutions we developed. They're pushing things like insurance to their absolute breaking point.
So this is really about understanding why mastering probability is, a critical survival strategy for a civilization. It's about moving beyond superstition to get objective results.
In a world that feels more volatile than ever.
Okay, so let's unpack this monumental shift in worldview. The sources are so clear that this wasn't about a lack of technology. They had the tools.
Right, they're just looking at them completely the wrong way. And we have to start with the astragalus.
The animal heel bone.
Yes, it's a brilliant historical artifact. It's the heel bone from a sheep or a goat, and it's naturally shaped like an irregular tetrahedron. And people used it in games and rituals for at least 5,000 years.
From Mesopotamia right up to the Romans.
All the way through. It could land on 4 different sides. But here's the critical physical limitation that stopped any statistical theory from forming. The bones were inherently irregular.
So not like a modern die, which is designed to be perfectly symmetrical. The astragalus was lopsided by nature.
Exactly. That lack of physical uniformity meant you could not assume the symmetry that you need for the law of large numbers. If you tossed one of these bones 5 million times, the results wouldn't settle on a reliable, predictable fraction, like, 1/6 for a standard die.
Because every bone was unique?
Every bone was unique, so the results were inherently unstable and specific to that one object. Without stable, repeatable results over many trials, you just cannot codify a statistical law. The very foundation for something like statistical quality control was missing, and they didn't even know they needed it.
And that lack of statistical viability, that actually reinforces the philosophical purpose, right? If the outcome is physically unpredictable, then the result must be intentional. It must be a message.
Precisely. These rituals were known as divination, and they served an incredibly important social function. The leaders, the kings, the generals doing this, they weren't gambling in our sense of the word. They weren't trying to maximize profit. They were using what you'd call an exopsychic method for making decisions.
Exopsychic. So moving the burden of the decision outside of your own mind, delegating that immense responsibility.
That's the key. You delegate the decision and, crucially, the blame if things go wrong to an external, unquestionable source, the gods, fate, whatever.
So if a military campaign fails after you consult the bones, it's not the king's fault.
It's not the king's bad strategy. It was the will of the creator. This process was a huge pressure release valve. It reduced social anger, rebellion, instability. It was a tool for social stability, not empirical planning.
It's a kind of ancient risk governance, really,
Right.
shifting the political risk away from the ruler, which must have been central to how ancient states actually mobilized their people and resources. This brings us to late Shang China.
Late Shang China, roughly 16th to 11th century BCE, is a stunning example of this link between divine approval and state power. The core strength of the Shang state was its ability to mobilize massive amounts of labor, the zong or ren.
And these weren't just soldiers.
No, not at all. They were for agriculture, warfare, huge construction projects like city walls, massive royal tombs, resource gathering, everything.
So today we'd use spreadsheets, census data, resource estimates. How did a Shang ruler justify mobilizing thousands of people?
Through thousands of oracle bone divinations, which they carefully recorded. The sources really stressed that the primary function of these rituals wasn't to, say, forecast the weather. It was to get explicit approval from the powers, the royal ancestors, the high gods, for any big action they were thinking of taking.
So before the king says, we need 5,000 men to build this dam, he first has to consult the bones.
Every time. The timing, the location, the specific number of troops, all of these basic state decisions were run through a religious filter, first to confirm they had divine consent. The whole process was highly ritualized, formalized. It was about communicating that the work being done was at the behest of a superhuman power.
So their entire system of resource management, which is the bedrock of any strong state, was dictated by ritual and divine approval, not a cold calculation of risk or what was possible.
Exactly. The state had the power to command labor, but only with permission from the heavens. To try and calculate the probability of success, to try and predict the outcome empirically, that would have completely undermined the whole system. It would be replacing divine will with human calculation.
And this explains why the idea of a random, purposeless outcome was just intellectually off the table for 5,000 years.
It had no place.
Which makes it all the more striking when we jump back to 1842 in the U.S. v. Holmes case. By then, the math for probability theory was well established, yet the judge is still talking about a lottery as an appeal to God. It just shows the incredible psychological comfort you get from delegating that kind of terrible responsibility.
It absolutely does. And the mathematical breakthrough, what we call the birth of the science of uncertainty, it required more than just smart people. It required a total philosophical rejection of that ancient comfort.
And this is where mathematicians like Girolamo Cardano in the 16th century and then Pascal and Fermat in the 17th come in. What was the specific philosophical wall they had to break through?
They had to despiritualize the physical world. For the math to work, they had to get past the idea that every coin toss was a unique message from God, that sealed letter we mentioned.
Right.
Instead, they had to start treating a dice roll as a purely physical test of the object's symmetry. Its predictability was a result of its physical properties, nothing more.
And this is where the law of large numbers comes into play.
Precisely. You can't predict a single toss. There are too many tiny random variables. But if you toss the die millions of times, all those individual irregularities, they just cancel each other out.
Yeah.
The results converge exactly on the physical symmetry of the object itself.
So that's the analogy in the sources. You stop looking for a single intentional command and you start observing the collective predictable behavior of a mass, like a school of fish.
And that transition is everything. It's the difference between seeing an irregularity as a sign of divine purpose versus seeing it as a statistical error you need to correct. This philosophical shift was the prerequisite for statistical quality control, which, later enabled the technological rise of Eastern manufacturing.
How so?
A reliable, predictable output, a perfectly symmetric die, a perfect gear, a flawless microchip. That is the fundamental physical evidence of industrial efficiency.
Yeah.
You couldn't even standardize a predictable die until you accepted that its predictability came from its physical symmetry, not the intentions of the person throwing it.
And that radical acceptance that sometimes an outcome is just physics, not purpose, is what let us build modern systems. This new way of thinking empowered states to manage huge infrastructure projects. It ensured social stability, and it led directly to tools like insurance. It created an empirical basis for planning that was completely unavailable to the Shang Kings.
So we did it. We developed mathematics of probability. We built these massive, globally connected systems based on actuarial science. In theory, we should be masters of risk. We should be able to predict and protect against all foreseeable threats.
And yet, time and again, we fail spectacularly. We fail to manage or even to see the most consequential events coming.
This is where the human element crashes back into the equation, long after we supposedly despiritualized everything.
Right. We can calculate the odds of a coin flip to 1,000 decimal places, but we still can't calculate for human cognitive failure.
Exactly. And this brings us to the very popular but often misunderstood concept of the black swan, as defined by Nicholas Nassim Taleb. We have to stick to his strict definition.
It's not just a rare event.
No, it's an event characterized by three things. It's rare, it has an extreme impact, and, crucially for our discussion, it has retrospective predictability. You can only really explain it or rationalize it after it has already happened.
And focusing too much on trying to anticipate every single one of those rare, massive events, it leads to a strategic dead end. Why is that?
It's the problem of the infinite list. If your strategy is based on anticipating every possible catastrophe that could happen but hasn't yet, you just drown in what-ifs. Flying cats, six-legged cats, as the saying goes.
Right.
We can all imagine 1,000 ways global supply chains could snap or a war could break out. Trying to organize that infinitely long list of low-probability, high-impact events into a concrete plan, it's paralyzing. Strategy has to focus on the finite and the probable.
Which means the real problem isn't our failure to anticipate the rare event, it's our failure to recognize the reality that's unfolding right in front of us.
Precisely. The second major issue is the illusion of suddenness. When we look back at history, we tend to collapse time. We make these huge seismic shifts seem like they happened overnight.
The fall of the Berlin Wall, the 2008 financial crisis, a pandemic, we talk about them as sudden shocks.
But the truth is that these consequential events almost always had months or even years of weak but discernible signals beforehand. The actual challenge then isn't accurately anticipating what might happen in 5 years. It's the timely recognition of what is happening right now, even if that reality completely contradicts what we want to believe.
And that's where human bias, our modern secular version of fatalism, takes over. Let's dig into how this played out in a couple of devastating historical examples.
Okay.
Let's start with Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the massive German invasion of the Soviet Union. The sources are absolutely clear. This was only a surprise to one person.
Joseph Stalin.
The scale of this is it's staggering. 3.5 million Axis troops on an 1,800-mile front.
Possibly the largest land invasion in all of history. And yet, despite months of this massive German force buildup, strategic positioning, logistical preparations right on his border, Stalin just refused to see what was happening.
His own intelligence services must have been screaming at him.
They were. And it was hyper-accurate intelligence. His apparatus, which included incredible agents like Richard Sorge in Japan, gave Moscow an astonishingly detailed picture. Sorge accurately detailed the invasion's objectives, the immense force strength, the strategy, and critically, the opening date of the attack.
But Stalin had a different story he preferred.
He had a pre-existing theory he was committed to, the German feint theory.
The idea that this was all a big fake-out.
Yes. The Germans deliberately spread disinformation, that the buildup was just a feint, a large-scale troop movement to get their forces out of range of British bombers before an assault on the UK. This was the explanation Stalin wanted to believe. He was convinced Hitler wouldn't attack him until Britain was defeated.
So, classic confirmation bias. He filtered all the incoming data to fit his preferred story.
He did more than filter it. He weaponized categorization. Any intelligence report that contradicted his feint theory was immediately labeled unreliable, unconfirmed, or even worse, dismissed as coming from agents provocateurs trying to trick the Soviet Union into a war.
He was changing the facts to match his theory.
Fundamentally. And that failure of recognition led to a disaster that almost caused the total collapse of the Soviet state.
And it's terrifying because the financial world repeated this exact same pattern almost 70 years later with the 2008 financial crisis, a shock that supposedly came from nowhere.
The signals were not black swans. They were, as some say, red beards. They were clearly visible if you were willing to look. The subprime mortgage industry was obviously overheating, and the clearest early signal wasn't Lehman Brothers collapsing in late 2008.
It was much earlier.
It was the collapse of New Century Financial in March and April of 2007. New Century was one of the largest originators of these risky subprime mortgages.
A major player at the heart of the market goes under. That's a signal that should be impossible to miss. Why did so many professionals ignore it?
It was the same willful blindness, but this time it was compounded by financial self-interest and a religious faith in their quantitative models. The sources talk about two Bear Stearns asset managers who, even as the evidence mounted that their investments were failing, simply couldn't bring themselves to believe the picture was as dire as the model suggested.
They refused to accept that the world they had modeled and built their careers on was fundamentally wrong. It's almost like they were delegating responsibility for the bad outcome. Not to a god, but to the model itself.
That is the direct link back to the ancient fatalism. When the facts get uncomfortable, the human impulse is to retreat to a comforting authority, whether it's divine will or a quantitative algorithm. This refusal to update your worldview when you get contradictory data, that's what we call the syllogistic error.
Okay, let's really break down the syllogistic error because it seems to be the core cognitive flaw that turns predictable events into so-called surprises.
Think about the classic problem of induction. If you see 1,000 swans and every single one is white, you form a very strong inductive theory. All swans are white. This becomes your major premise. It's an article of faith.
So what happens when you see a black swan?
Pure, cold logic demands that you reject your major premise. Your theory was wrong. But our brains rarely work that way, especially when the stakes are high. We tend to use deduction emotionally.
We cling to the premise.
We prefer the comfortable logic. If my premise, all swans are white, is absolutely true, and I am looking at a black bird, then my conclusion must be that this black bird is not a swan.
We change the facts. The black bird becomes a silly man in a fur coat, to use the analogy.
Exactly. Stalin was emotionally attached to the idea that Hitler wouldn't attack, so the incoming intelligence had to be redefined as not true intelligence. The Bear Stearns managers were attached to their perfect mathematical models, so the collapsing market data had to be redefined as a temporary aberration, not a systemic failure.
So how do we fight this as individuals, as organizations? How do we institutionalize a resistance to this incredibly dangerous failure of recognition?
We have to consciously overcome that ancient impulse to delegate responsibility to a comforting narrative. The sources suggest 3 maxims for recognition.
What's the first?
The first is fundamental, provisionality. We have to actively adopt the worldview that everything we believe about reality is just provisional. The key is to mentally add the words "so far" to all our assertions. If I believe the market is stable, I must force myself to think the market is stable so far.
That little cognitive trick keeps the door open to new data.
It creates a necessary humility. The moment you declare something absolutely certain, you stop looking for data that proves you wrong, and you have set yourself up for a catastrophic failure.
Okay, the second maxim deals with the psychology of overconfidence, the cost of certainty.
Certainty is not free. It comes with huge cognitive costs, especially when you're wrong. Look at General Douglas MacArthur in the Korean War. His legendary confidence was vital during the high-risk Incheon landings. It drove clear, aggressive action that paid off spectacularly. But that same absolute certainty, his unwavering belief that China would not enter the war, which he held on to until Chinese troops were literally overrunning his positions, that certainty delayed his recognition of reality for weeks.
The cost of his certainty was measured in thousands of lives and a huge strategic defeat.
Exactly. Confidence only pays off when it results in clear choices and immediate action. Beyond that point becomes a liability. It prevents timely recognition and exposes you to terrible, unnecessary risk.
And the third maxim helps us figure out what data we should actually be paying attention to.
This is maybe the most actionable one. Value improbable data. You have to pay special, disproportionate attention to data that is unlikely in light of your current beliefs, because improbable information contains the maximum information content. It has the greatest potential to fundamentally change your understanding of the world. Think about it. If you see data that confirms what you already believe, that has very little informational value. It just reaffirms your theory.
The only data that should really change your strategy is the data that defies your expectations.
That is the black swan that actually matters. Not the one you try to anticipate in some infinite list of futures, but the one you recognize is happening right now, even though it feels statistically impossible according to your existing model.
So we've traced this incredible arc from the ancient fatalism of the gods, past the modern cognitive blindness of someone like Stalin, and now we're confronting the final irony. The very mathematical tools we created to manage risk are themselves being broken by the sheer scale of our problems.
The crisis we face today isn't a crisis of math. It's a crisis of scale and frequency. Modern insurance, which is really the physical manifestation of probability theory, it relies on three core things: actuarial science, the law of large numbers, and risk homogeneity.
It assumes risks are independent, they're not systemic, and that catastrophes are rare.
And we have to remember, insurance isn't just a business, it's a primary social good. It's the silent infrastructure that lets you buy a house or get healthcare because it spreads individual random risks across a huge, stable pool.
And that infrastructure is now buckling.
It is. The core functions of insurers pooling risk, investing capital, managing that risk are being completely overturned by these complex, interconnected systemic threats. Climate change, rapid technological risk like cyber warfare, geopolitical instability.
And even with all the big data and AI we have, which you'd think would make prediction better, risk modeling is hitting some fundamental limits. What are they?
Well, you can group them. First, there's the persistence of individual irrationality. An actuary can model the probability of an earthquake in a city or the collective frequency of car accidents among a million drivers. But they can never, ever predict the exact date an individual driver will crash their car. That individual randomness is irreducible.
Okay, what's the second limit?
Data scarcity. For events that happen too infrequently, like a mega tsunami or a region-defining earthquake, we just don't have enough historical data to make statistically reliable predictions. And it's the same for brand new risks, like industrial cyber attacks or certain mental health crises. There isn't enough accumulated data for robust actuarial tables. We're flying blind.
And while the modeling is struggling with these new risks, the sheer financial scale of established risks, especially climate, is making the entire model just unsustainable.
The data is screaming at us. The number of weather-related disasters worldwide has increased fivefold since 1970. This isn't a gradual trend. It's an acceleration that fundamentally breaks the idea of risk rarity. Storms, floods, heat waves, they're stopping being rare, random events, and are becoming predictable, certain costs.
And you can see this shift from rarity to certainty right on the balance sheets. The data from France, for instance, is pretty stark.
In France, the bill for weather-related insurance claims has tripled in the last 40 years. And their own regulators project that if global temperatures rise even moderately, between 1.4 and 2.6 degrees Celsius, insurance premiums could surge by 130 to 200%.
That's the tipping point. That's where risk pooling fails. When a risk becomes certain, it's no longer insurable. It just becomes a guaranteed annual tax on living somewhere.
And that's the context for that chilling statement from Miguel Castries, the former CEO of AXA, years ago. He said, "A world at plus 2 degrees C might still be insurable, but a world at plus 4 degrees C would certainly no longer be."
That 4-degree marker is the point where climate impacts are so frequent and severe that they just exceed the entire financial and actuarial capacity of private markets.
And this isn't just about physical destruction. The digital world is seeing the exact same actuarial failure when it comes to cyber threats.
Ransomware specifically.
Yes. Ransomware is becoming fundamentally uninsurable because the losses are systemic and the frequency is accelerating. In that sector, the compensation payments, what insurers are paying out, are already exceeding the total premiums they're collecting.
That's not a sustainable business.
No. And the sources point out that in some places, like France, the law can permit compensating ransom payments, which has this perverse effect of using the insurance pool to inadvertently fund and legitimize the criminal's business model. The risk pool is basically subsidizing cybercrime.
And when a risk becomes that overwhelming, the rational thing for an insurer to do is to simply retreat.
And the retreat is happening now, globally. In the U.S., insurers are pulling out of Florida's floodplains and Louisiana's hurricane coast. In Australia, the risk of coastal erosion is just not covered for new homes anymore. This systematic withdrawal of insurance increases society's vulnerability and pushes all the risk back onto individuals and the state.
This forces us to look at this regionally because these systemic risks play out so differently around the planet, which makes any kind of unified response incredibly difficult. Let's start with Europe.
Europe faces these huge structural challenges from demographic aging. Overall life expectancy is high, but the critical number is that life expectancy in good health has stagnated since the mid-2000s.
Which puts a huge strain on healthcare system.
A huge strain. They were designed to treat acute illness, not the chronic diseases like diabetes and cancer that come with an aging population. And at the same time, climate change is hitting European infrastructure in a way that's less dramatic than a hurricane, but just as devastating financially.
You're talking about the shrinkage and swelling of clay soil.
Yes. As droughts become more frequent and severe in Western Europe, clay soils expand when they're wet and contract dramatically when they're dry. This destabilizes foundations, it cracks buildings. It's not a sudden flood, it's a slow, cumulative structural decay. In France alone, the cost of this specific damage could increase by 50 to 300% by 2050.
And that detail is so important because it explains exactly how climate acceleration breaks national risk pooling systems, like the French CatNat system.
The Catastrophe Naturelle scheme is a public-private partnership. It works because it defines a natural disaster as an event that is abnormal, statistically rare, happening maybe once every 10 years or less.
But with climate change, the disasters stop being abnormal.
Exactly. If a flood that used to happen once a decade now happens every 5 years, it no longer meets the legal definition of abnormal for the CatNat system. It becomes a predictable event. And at that point, the risk pool is legally and financially broken. Coverage stops, and the burden falls to the homeowner or the state. The math of the whole scheme just dissolves because of the frequency.
Now, shifting to Latin America, the challenges are completely different. It's not just about climate, it's about deep-seated societal structures.
Latin America is defined by entrenched high levels of inequality, which the sources suggest are unlikely to reverse even by 2040. This creates systemic vulnerability. You've got a region that's dealing with developing country diseases like malaria at the same time as dealing with aging population diseases like obesity, and public health spending is critically low.
But the single biggest corrosive factor for any kind of risk management there is low institutional trust.
Absolutely. The high level of mistrust in institutions and politicians, in the tax system, it's an invisible barrier. Insurance is, at its heart, a system of neutralization. We all pay into a pool to protect the unlucky few.
And if you don't trust the people running the pool,
you're not going to pay in. If citizens don't trust that the system will be fair and transparent and that the state is strong enough to backstop these risks, they'll refuse to participate. Low trust mathematically breaks mutualization.
Moving to Africa, the issue is less about trust and more about capacity and the speed of development.
Africa has the lowest rate of effective social coverage in the world, just 17.4%. This is mostly due to immature tax systems and often severe debt distress. And the sources highlight that rapid, undersized urbanization is creating huge vulnerabilities. Millions are moving into these massive, informal cities that lack adequate infrastructure and sanitation.
And that deficit turns a climate event into a complex humanitarian crisis.
We saw that tragically with Cyclone Freddy in 2023 in Malawi and Mozambique. The cyclone didn't just cause damage. The heavy rains and lack of hygiene infrastructure in these dense informal cities directly fueled cholera epidemics that were already underway. The risks compound each other.
But Africa also presents a unique opportunity for new solutions, driven by mobile tech.
Yes. Despite the capacity issues, Africa leads the world in mobile money usage. A third of adults have a mobile money account. That existing digital platform offers a clean slate to create innovative, digitally delivered insurance solutions, completely bypassing the need for expensive physical infrastructure.
Finally, Asia. A really complex mix of hyperdevelopment and vast social disparity.
You have extreme aging in countries like Japan and China, creating this urgent need for elderly care. But then in South Asia, you see these staggering levels of gender inequality, which dramatically increase climate vulnerability.
The statistic on that is just shocking.
It is. In South Asia, women are 14 times more likely to die in a climate disaster. 70% of the victims of the 2004 tsunami were women. This isn't a statistical fluke. It reflects deep social vulnerability, where women are often less mobile, less trained, and denied access to information.
And their education systems are creating an entirely different kind of systemic risk.
Precisely. In the most developed Asian nations, you have this hyper-competitive, high-stakes meritocracy that is driving some of the highest student suicide rates in the world. The intense pressure is creating massive new mental health risks that the existing health insurance models are just not equipped to handle. The system is paradoxically destroying the very human capital it's built on.
When you look at that whole global landscape of interconnected threats, it's overwhelmingly clear that the probabilistic tools we built centuries ago are just. They're overwhelmed. We need new levers for civilizational survival, moving toward a much more holistic risk governance.
The scale of the needs dictates that insurers have to evolve way beyond their traditional role of just pooling risk and paying claims. They have to become active partners with public actors in preventing and mitigating risk.
And this starts with reaching the people who need protection the most, but are completely shut out of the system right now.
That's the lever of inclusive insurance. Less than 3% of the poorest half of humanity, the most vulnerable people on the planet, have access to any kind of insurance. Initiatives like the UN's Insure Resilience are trying to change that, covering the poorest households exposed to extreme climate changes.
And they're doing this with innovative models.
Often through things like microinsurance products distributed via those mobile networks in Africa we just talked about. By aggregating demand across millions of low-premium accounts and using that digital platform, they can achieve the stability that the law of large numbers requires. They can build resilience from the ground up.
The second lever uses the immense financial power of the insurance industry itself, shifting it from just managing capital to making preventative investments.
Insurers are among the world's largest institutional investors. They manage trillions of dollars. They have to increase their investment aimed directly at preventing and reducing vulnerability, not just budgeting to pay for it after the disaster hits.
So this means funding things like climate adaptation infrastructure.
Exactly. Resilient housing, flood defenses. It also means potentially facilitating compulsory insurance schemes for risks that governments don't want to cover directly. We're already seeing movement here. French insurers have significantly cut their exposure to thermal coal. The focus has to shift from managing financial capital to actively financing resilient infrastructure.
And finally, we have to come back to the cognitive challenge. Overcoming the limits of our own organizational design through what you call holistic governance.
The succession of crises, COVID, the financial crash, climate, it shows that risks rarely arrive alone. Systemic crises emerge from the accumulation of interconnected threats. So we have to overcome this deeply ingrained cognitive barrier of looking at risks one by one.
Our organizations are built to optimize existing processes, not to adapt to huge shifts.
They are. And that structural bias requires mobilizing collective intelligence. The complexity of future crises is too great for any single actor to understand alone. Risk governance has to bring in a wider range of actors: private companies, public bodies, civil associations, community groups.
More diverse assembly to mitigate those cognitive biases.
The sources even echo Aristotle on this. He argued that while no single member of the masses is superior, the collective, once gathered, is often wiser than the elite minority because they have more perspectives, more distributed intelligence.
So we need more eyes on the problem, not just one expert eye. And those eyes have to be looking forward, using foresight analysis.
Absolutely. Resilient governance means constantly testing your assumptions against those improbable high-impact scenarios. Foresight analysis forces organizations to move beyond simple trend following and explicitly work through disruptive scenarios using the crucial "so what" approach. If temperatures rise 2.5 degrees, so what does that mean for our supply chains, our social stability? It demands we overcome both ancient fatalism and modern cognitive bias by making the uncomfortable, improbable truth actionable today. So our journey today has traced this remarkable arc. We successfully detached the outcome of a dice cost from divine purpose, and that created the science of probability. That conceptual breakthrough gave us these powerful state-building tools like actuarial science and insurance.
Tools that really underpinned modern stability and empirical planning. Yet, as the sources confirm, our human political and cognitive biases just persist. The Stalin problem, the black swan problem. We fail to recognize threats right in front of us because we'd rather change the facts to match our comfortable theories.
And now, the risks themselves: accelerated climate change, Systemic digital risks, vast inequalities, are overwhelming the capacity of our own probabilistic tools. They're making critical risks financially uninsurable and threatening the entire principle of risk pooling around the globe.
So survival in this volatile, globalized era requires moving beyond mere statistical calculation. It demands that civilizations apply these hard lessons from the past, consciously embracing the provisional nature of their beliefs and cultivating the political and collective will to act on that improbable, high-impact data before the black swan becomes the red beard.